All right, thank you very much, colleagues. 1, 2 checking. Is Dr. Sam there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, I think we are ready to go, Doc.
Yes, yeah, let's go. Let's go.
Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Hi everybody, and welcome to this session for Africa Week in 2021 under very challenging circumstances. But then again, we are reminded that this struggle for an Africa we want still must continue, because we find ourselves again in a maelstrom of more complex issues as we still continue to consider legacies that have continued to encumber us, and they suddenly find themselves entangled with our moment now. And so I'm welcoming you to what I believe is a very powerful session with fellow Africans, fellow, allies and, soldiers in this struggle. And most importantly, and I'm encouraged to see new soldiers, younger generation of soldiers in this fight. And if I might, sort of set tempo or tone for this talk as someone who is, I consider myself a student of Africa and African life, I begin with an injunction that was given by one of the founding thinkers, who encouraged a cognitive change in how we approach Africa, and that is Chinua Achebe, who argued and told people and actually cautioned that the African injunction that was given by one of is not guaranteed. It has to be fought for. And I like that injunction because what he was saying is, even though he had written good work and others have written, the work is still not done. So the dialogues in this Africa Week, starting with this one today, are an invitation to continue this injunction in new and powerful points of entry. And this is entry points around, continually imagining possibilities about a livable future for Africa. And it depends on the quality of self-conception that we have as Africans in the now. And so these young thinkers, these young soldiers of Africa are carrying on with this question and this struggle for a quality of self-conception. They're posing that question, they're holding it, and they're running with it. And of course, this has to do with what someone else called a futurable Africa, a kind of Africa.
I think you're on mute.
Right. Hi, Dr. Sam. I think you
on mute.
Accidentally muted yourself.
All right. Sorry, I don't know what happened. I really apologize for that.
All right.
I mean, I'll just quickly run through this. I was saying thank you again for coming around and participating in this. And I was highlighting that this is an invitation to consider an injunction that was given to us by among the leading thinkers of Africa, who said that the kind of Africa we imagine or one we want is not guaranteed. It has to be fought for. And we know that because this struggle has been going on for a long time, and the current events show us that the struggle is still on. And I'm so glad that at the moment, with this injunction for fighting for a livable Africa, these dialogues invite us into very powerful points of entry, again, with a different kind of soldier, a younger African soldier in this regard. And so we are being invited by these young thinkers, and even all of us should put ourselves then in a place where, while we are dialoguing with them, we think about these kinds of questions. What is the nature of this struggle today? Or what is the quality of content that can advance this struggle? And what sort of Africa do we think? And I'll repeat that. What kind of Africa do we think is worth striving for? And then how should we act and strive on this Africa Week How should we think and strive to act differently in the here and now and moving forward? And I would say then, this struggle at this moment and with this dialogue, it begins with the struggle to forge cognitive independence and sovereignty through new resources, repurposing, different ways of knowing that are continually transformative, and even repurposing and rejuvenating some of those whose power has not lapsed or we have not even spent time, visiting and engaging with. And I believe that this dialogue and these young soldiers in this struggle for this Africa we think is worth striving for will give us then other avenues, points of entry, and elevate us to another plane as we move in this struggle. So thank you so much and welcome. At this moment, I'm going to invite my brother Sonwabo to invite the first speaker and introduce him. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam, for setting the tone. Really, as you were talking, I was already salivating and looking forward to this conversation of today. Without wasting any time, colleagues, our first speaker for today's webinar, it's going to be our friend in the context of the university, someone who is very familiar in our own spaces, especially around Africa education and around Africa literature. His name is Uvelimbele Uba Usompisi, who is an Afrocentric essayist. Velimbele is the writer. He's the lover of jazz and soul music, who likes to surround himself with positive-minded Black people. He is also a co-founder of the Black Power Front and the online Afrocentric channel Umutapa. Without wasting any time, I would like to invite Velimbele to address us on this topic for today. Over to you, Veli. Thank you.
Hey, Sibonge Babu Stirman for the very brief, introduction, and I prefer that it be kept like that. It should be an introduction, and it should not be an obituary, right? Thank you so much for that. Can I also acknowledge Babun Zioki, and in particular, I am strengthened by your opening remarks. Two things in particular, where you highlight the importance of the quality of self-conception for Africans today, in particular for our generation. But related to that, you raise another very critical question, right? What is the kind of Africa that we should or are prepared to strive for? And it is almost as if we were thinking together, when I was preparing my thoughts for this presentation. May I also take this opportunity to acknowledge, one of Africa's brightest stars, Usisi Ufunzani Mthembu, Utatewetu. And also just acknowledge everybody also, who is part of this discussion and thinks we are worthy of their very elegant ears, So we thank the opportunity. In the time given, right, we will seek to share our musings on the question that we have given, African ways of knowing and the quest for cognitive sovereignty, right? And before we go into the actual subject, it is perhaps important that we start by just explaining, and this is inspired by the topic, that the manner in which we have gathered today was inspired by a set of particular events, right? And these events resulted in what we call African Liberation Day. And today has morphed into something very strange called Africa Day. Now, it is also important that in the context of this discussion, that we also just remind ourselves, right, that is this day really Africa Day or is it African Liberation Day? So in 1958, right, the founding leader of independent Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, convened a meeting in April 1958 of African leaders and activists, wherein the discussion centered around the need to have a moment wherein we as Africans would reflect on the progress that we shall have made insofar as extracting ourselves is concerned from foreign domination. As a product of that discussion in 1958 in Ghana, an agreement was reached that a day must be designated to mark that type of reflection by Africans. And the agreement in that meeting in 1958 was to have the 15th of April each year being commemorated as Africa Freedom Day. And then a couple of discussions later, as Dr. Nkrumah engaged with other African leaders, including Emperor Haile Selassie, then an agreement was made for another meeting in May 1963 in Ethiopia. And in that meeting, in addition to the designation of the 15th of April as African Freedom Day, part of the discussion also then morphed into the space of saying we must have a continental body that will be charged with the responsibility to pursue the agenda of African liberation, which led to the founding of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. Then an amendment was also proposed at the same meeting of the day from African Freedom Day rather, to African Liberation Day, right? So the decision to designate the day as African Liberation Day was taken in 1963. So it then also helps us to understand that in historical terms, there is no such a thing as Africa Day. It is African Liberation Day, and it is a day which was designated for Africans to take a moment to reflect on the extent to which they have extricated themselves from foreign domination. So you would then understand why I won't be wishing you Happy Africa Day. Insofar as the framework for the presentation is concerned, I will basically just attempt to answer three questions. The first question is, why is discourse important for a culturally distinct group? Two, how does cognitive hegemony manifest itself in popular discourse? And then the last question will concern itself with what Afrocentric alternatives are we proposing to the current hegemonic Eurocentric and anti-Black forms of popular discourse? As it relates to the first question, right, as my launchpad, I wish to lean on the words of one of the foremost Afrocentric thinkers and theoreticians, Ubaba Mulefikete Asante, who makes the point that, and I quote, Afrocentricity is the idea that Africans must see themselves as centered in our own history and culture. I am increasingly realizing that the biggest cognitive battlefield for African people today continues to be the subject of history. In my view, what is referred to as the subject of history is actually knowledge of self. To understand and grasp all externalities, we must first understand and know and master the self, which is the true self. If we as Africans accept the current hegemonic version of history, which is the knowledge of self of others, as the absolute and ultimate truth, we are not just accepting a historical account. We are also accepting a historical timeline. We are also accepting a historical memory. Most fundamentally, we are accepting an instrument of location and navigation. Consequently, some of the most revered elements of the dominant worldview that we have accepted as valid and universal, such as knowledge, truth, value, beliefs, deities, progress, achievement, or victory are actually definitional derivatives of a worldview that is not ours, but that of our enslavers. In this sense, all that we today uphold or revere as knowledge, time, truth, value, beliefs, deities, progress, achievement, or victory are all horribly false representations of time and space as conceived by our enslavers. This is the case because, as one of our principal oppressors, the European has constructed the world in such a way as to present himself as the epitome of human existence and human thought. And from this developed concomitant epistemologies to legitimize, maintain, defend, and reproduce the monumental white lie. All this cognitive violence was not just created and legitimized through the invading armies of Europe, but also through the facility of some of Europe's most celebrated philosophers. In his Philosophy Geography, Volume 2, Immanuel Kant wrote, and I quote, "Humanity reaches its greatest perfection in the white race. The Negroes are lower, and are lower even some of the American people," close quote. In his lectures on philosophy, George Hegel wrote, and I quote, "Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit," close quote. And in his 1753 essay titled "Of National Characters," David Hume wrote, "I am apt to suspect that the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, right, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any complexion other than white, nor even an individual eminent in their action or speculation, no ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no science," close quote. What position do racists like Kant, Hegel, and Hume occupy in the literature that African students are exposed to today? From this, we as African people need to understand that 2 of the most important epistemic and methodological questions we must understand are the following. For us, the most important subject is the study of our own history, our own lived experience. And 2, in studying our history, we must never make the mistake of looking at phenomena as disconnected. This is where from the problem of false consciousness emanates. For this reason, one of the things we must give particular attention to is popular discourse and how it is framed. Who asks the fundamental questions about the meaning of human existence? Who provides the answers to those questions? And in what language are these questions asked? Therefore, given our position as an essentially dominated people, it is absolutely critical that we as Africans pay serious attention to the nomenclature that we use in seeking to understand the self and the world. We need to understand that language and its related words, phrases, terms, concepts, or paradigms play a critical role, not just in the process of identity formation, but also in the construction of group consciousness and the capacity of members of such a group to determine whether such consciousness is historically valid or false. Therefore, for us as Africans, language shouldn't merely be an ornament of cultural heritage. Language for us as Africans should and must be an instrument with which to develop consciousness, an instrument of resistance. For as long as we remain a dominated people, we ought to only speak one language, and that is the language of resistance. What exactly do I mean by a language of resistance? By language of resistance, I refer here to a set of well thought out indigenous cognitive coordinates and complementary behavior patterns, right? Whose primary purpose is to consistently keep us focused on the fundamental questions of being. Questions such as, who am I? Where do I come from? Do I have enemies and who are they? Do I have allies and who are they? Where am I going? Where am I supposed to be? How do I get there? And perhaps most importantly, what stands in my way of getting there? So before we as Africans participate in anything, we must first establish three fundamental questions. One, who are we? Two, what is our reason for existence? And three, who is inviting us to participate in what? As it relates to the second question, the power to define is not only central to our understanding of the true nature of the self and of the world, it is also central to our understanding of the true nature of human existence and the variables that regulate them. One of the most important variables in the regulation of human relations is the notion or the concept of power. Power is essentially a construct or a framework that prescribes and regulates the content and the character of human relations. As a product of the human mind, the concept or the notion of power can take both tangible and intangible form. Through the ages, one of the ways in which non-Black groups, and in particular the Europeans, have maintained their dominance over us has been through the power to define phenomena. Europeans have not only abrogated to themselves the power to arbitrarily decide what phenomena should be called, but they have also abrogated to themselves the power to decide what exists and what does not exist. For instance, in the European mind, the non-white world and non-white people didn't exist, and neither did they have any civilization or history until they were discovered by Europeans. Which means we come into existence when Europeans decide we come into existence. Therefore, the power to define always assumes the historiocultural logic of the ones doing the defining. Put differently, definitions assume the cultural logic of those who invent them. As part of the continuing and globalized cognitive hegemony of Europeans, we continue to see how in mainstream media and academic discourse, conceptual contraptions, right, such as failed state, rebels, dictator, looting, or corruption continue to be applied as euphemisms for African people and their behavior. We have seen how the word Holocaust has been made synonymous with the experience of the Jews and not with the experience of the Herero and Nama, against whom the Germans committed the first genocide of the 20th century. European cognitive hegemony helps us to understand why the experience of the Palestinians at the hands of the Israelis, right, will receive greater global attention than the genocide against our kin that is currently unfolding in West Papua. European cognitive hegemony will also help us understand why there is more global attention on what is happening in Yemen and Myanmar, and very little, if any, attention on the fact that over 6 million of us have perished in the minerals-driven conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In a nutshell, European cognitive hegemony creates a situation where we as Africans are more sensitive to the pain and suffering of others and totally desensitized to our own pain and suffering, almost as to suggest that the pain and suffering of African people is something normal, and that there is therefore no need for the world to come to an abrupt, complete halt as a result of the pain and the suffering of African people. As it relates to the last question, what Afrocentric alternatives are we proposing to the current Eurocentric and anti-Black forms of popular discourse? If we are to extricate ourselves from the cognitive grip of Europeans and the indignity of being the perpetual cognitive infants of Europe, only with fancy titles, we need to deliberately and unapologetically develop Afrocentric cognitive frameworks that will enable us to engage with the world on our own terms. Some of the practical things we can do are the following. One, we must center everything we do in the teaching and the understanding of authentic African history, not African history that begins with the invasion of Africa by the Arabs and the Europeans. Two, as mainstream universities continue to fail to teach from an Afrocentric perspective, we must continue to build our own Afrocentric institutions. Good examples of these are institutions such as the Afrocology Institute in KZN, Ikamaku Institute in the Eastern Cape, and Ebukhosini in Gauteng. Three, African teachers, lecturers, and young activists must be trained to teach from an Afrocentric perspective, so that whenever they teach African children, they must, as a rule, reflect Africa and African people positively in the images and the symbols. All our learning material must conform to this. Four, among Africans, the teaching of all knowledge domains must deliberately stand outside the Euro-American cognitive axis and not conform to the Euro-American timeline. Meaning, we must not measure our existence and our progress by the cultural clock of Europe and America. Five, African children must know from an early age about great African civilizations like Kemet, the land of Black people and the origin of writing, Nubia, the land of gold and rule of queens, Axum, the land of knowledge and the study of books like the Kibrani Gast, Ghana, the land of gold and salt, Mali, the land of architects and astronomers, Songhai, the land of learning and the defenders of culture, and Mutapa, the land of the stonemasons. In conclusion, just as we molest and contaminate the cognitive universe of our children by exposing them to such mind-numbing white symbols like Spider-Man, Mickey Mouse, and Barbie dolls, we can also undo the cognitive molestation on our children by teaching them from an early age about the great African philosophers who tutored the revered Greek philosophers, African philosophers like Imhotep, Plahotep, Keti, Kananub, Duaf, Amortep, and many others. This, in my view, is how we can achieve cognitive sovereignty, a cogno-epistemic state or capacity to perceive and engage with time and space through our own cogno-spiritual instrument. Tamaku, ngiyabonga.
Thank you so much. I mean, that leaves us with a lot to reflect on in the next few minutes, and actually for a lot of us to carry in the university as we continue to work around questions of revitalizing our curricula, especially in humanities. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite our brother Sonwabo to introduce our second panelist. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Sam. All right, our second speaker in the last speaker, colleagues, is Miss Funzani Mtembu. Welcome, Sisi Abulelubanawe, my sister. Miss Funzani Mtembu is the multifaceted individual who has found a to bridge her passion for social justice and writing with her profession through activism and community work. She has been recognized as the top 200 young South African 2020. She works as a development economist and currently pursuing her master's degree in economics and development at Wits University. She has theorized on the intersection between. Funzani is one of the contributing authors of a book titled Living Theories and True Ideas in the 21st Century, Reflections on Marxism and Decolonialization. Funzani has worked on various economic policy projects, including that of the COVID-19 People's Coalition, Progressive Economist, and Economic Strategies paper for the South African Women in Dialogue. We can see that we are dealing, we have a great warrior in the house today. Funzani is a fervent activist who's worked with grassroots womenist organizations like Soweto Women's Forum on taxi safety for women. I think I will go to the last part, Funzani, if you don't mind me.
Yeah, for sure.
Cutting your
That's
biography.
a very
This
long
is
intro.
a very great. All right, I think I will just end with the last part that Funzani has contributed to publication around a Daily Maverick, Joburg Post, Culture Review, etc., etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to welcome Ms. Funzani Mthembu on the stage. Thank you, Sisi. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Putsunabo. And wow, that is actually quite a long bio, but in any case, thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, Brother Sompisi, for giving us so much food for thought. That was such a brilliant presentation that considers, our history. And I admire the fact, and I knew that this is exactly what I was going to get from your presentation, the examples and the practical examples that actually exist in the current, dispensation that we are experiencing. And also bringing us back to, the history of everything. So I think I really do appreciate your contribution. Thank you so much. So let me just start by commending the conveners of the seminar series. That is the Center of Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, for organizing what I regard as an intriguing range of talk themes and speakers. I have been tasked and honored to speak under the topic which speaks to the very work I have dedicated my activism towards, and that is African ways of knowing on the quest for cognitive sovereignty. So in the year 2015, the word decolonizing, was made quite popular within our universities. Students called for a decolonial education and therefore a decolonized society. And I believe at the heart of this question, inquiry, and call sits the cognitive sovereignty, because we can't have a decolonized society if we are not necessarily engaging with the ways in which we remember and we know, right? And so we know that the colonial and apartheid masters consistently denied the existence of any legacy among Africans worth preserving. And they invalidated African thought as well. An attitude born out in their insistence that Africans had no history nor capacity to create or think. Alternatively, where robust forms of local knowledges and creations could not be ignored nor denied, colonial masters sought to reshape and appropriate such knowledges into the service of colonialism. And this process has resulted into the displacement of forms of African knowledges, as is the displacement of the African body in the world. So African dispossession resulted into the dehumanization of the African and a disapproval of all that was associated with the African, and created a cultural and cognitive crisis for the African. This is the very crisis which continues to reproduce and reignite colonial ways of knowing and being. So the indoctrination of, and therefore the internalization of Western knowledges and ways of being has locked Africans into a perpetual state of non-being, in that the African has no liberty to think beyond this prison created by coloniality. So colonial domination in the sphere of knowledge production has played a role of emptying the minds of African people of their knowledges and memories, but also has played a part in implanting foreign ways of knowing and remembering. In their article, Coloniality of Knowledge and the Challenge of Creating African Futures, Ndlovu and Morgan reminds that there should be stated differences between coloniality and colonialism to understand the current position Africans' knowledge created, to understand the current position Africans and knowledge created by them at this point. And so they assert that coloniality is characterized in terms of a structure of colonialism. This structure of colonialism is both prescriptive and performative. In its prescriptive form, coloniality denies the possibility of change that is desired by an anti-systemic agency. In its performative manifestation, the power structure of coloniality is susceptible to transformation and rearrangement, but not destruction and collapse. Thus, it is through the process of transformation and rearrangement that the power structure of coloniality can evade those fundamental changes that are desired by the anti-systemic movement. This is how coloniality managed to survive the end of colonialism, because the collapse of colonialism was simply a performative episode within a prescriptive, continuous historical structure of coloniality. And so I argue then that the state in which the rest of the world resides in is vastly different to that in which the African, who has been disallowed of their humanness, lives in. And this is because of the very history of colonialism, which has created this superstructure of coloniality in which the African exists. And this structure then denies the African sovereignty to determine or imagine his or her future, particularly a future in which the African object is not subject to suppression of expression, nor subject to colonial exploitation. And so the denial of cognitive agency is by design and suits the agenda and objective of colonial project. And since the African has been relegated to being a parasite to the oppressor, in that we know that the relationship between the African and the colonial authorities has always been that of the parasite and producer, again, as Morgan and Ndlovu reminds us as well. And this is within even the realm of knowledge production. And so for the African to seek cognitive sovereignty, the African threatens the very condition that was created for them by the colonial authorities. And this can lead to the freedom of the African. And so African ways of knowing and the quest for cognitive sovereignty then becomes a form of resistance. And so when we begin to actually create our own ways of knowing and our own ways of being, that is symbolic to the very notion of our resistance. And I think that sits at the basics of our freedom. And so it is within the colonial masters' interest to ensure that the African remains in the current position that they find themselves in. So how do we reimagine our own ways of being, given this whole historical context? I argue that the work of archiving is one of the key cognitive sovereignty, is key to our cognitive sovereignty, sorry. In the book, The Archives and the Political Imaginary, Bekisizwe Peterson writes that the archive is a crucial component of the active labor of creating the political imaginary. That intellectual and cultural horizons that shape our grasp of personal and social identities and histories, where we come from and where we are destined. In a sense, then, archives, like history, draw on the impulses of introspection and anticipation as they seek to systemize the chaos of the past, organizing the fragments of the old world in ways that can renew the world we inhabit. And so I argue that the archiving becomes an important part of resisting and creating. And archiving of our lives and existence can be in different ways, shapes, and forms. They can be in art, they can be in writing. However, archiving becomes as an important way of resistance, cannot be understood within the realm of Western ways or Western knowledge of Western notions of knowledge production and Western ways of being and remembering. So to move away from our parasitical point in which we have been relegated to, archiving becomes a form of a joyful militancy, where those who have been historically oppressed can find expression and can find a space in which they can actually reimagine what their lives and their futures can look like. In this archiving, knowledge production then cannot be limited, as I mentioned earlier, and understood in the Western notions of remembering and knowing. It is imperative to stretch our imagination and remind ourselves of how our forebears maintained knowledge and created knowledge and drew from each other in the very communities in which they exist in. And so knowledge cannot simply be limited to that which we engage from a place or a point of books and what is institutionalized, but we have to actually understand knowledge as that which is also sits in the rural areas and sits with our grandmothers and our grandfathers. And so I think in conclusion, from my side, I would say that this very topic for me symbolizes the fact that we are beginning to actually have imperative conversations about the ways in which we actually engage or understand the very idea of what knowledge is and what does even rebellion actually looks like in the context of knowledge production. And so for me, we cannot simply say that the organizing of knowledge in a form of libraries and universities and schools is where knowledge begins and starts. But I do believe that we need to actually think about knowledge and in ways that encompasses our own way of being and how we have lived, whichever way that may look like, given that our identities have been so distorted historically. So that's where I will end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is quite powerful stuff, and I don't think I want to make commentary. I would leave it to the audience to ask questions. And of course, you already have very good questions to begin with. I'm sure our brother Veli has already seen some of the questions. And of course, I'm just going to quickly run through the first one. And people are welcome to continue writing questions as we go along. The first one is, I'm highly, and that comes from Nosizwe Mkeli and says, I'm highly intrigued by Veli Mbele's articulation of African people to regain their powers. My question is, do African people, especially leaders, are they willing to exercise their power that they possess? That's number one. When every African leader exercises power, such power is a victim of assassination. Of course, I mean, that would require more context. A victim of assassination, I don't know if it's political assassination, it's character assassination, or probably you'll just take it generally. I don't know how you'll want to interpret that. And then basically, I'm interested to see if we have warriors in Africa who are willing to die. I think that underscores the question. I don't know, I don't want to be off it, but I think what the question is asking, if somebody takes steps in and, steps up to try and push this different way of knowing at a very significant position of leadership, will they be able to do it? Or do we have examples of people who are willing to die? Or do we see it? Do we feel it? And the second question then is from Alan Zen, which asks, because he noted the wide-ranging overview of the importance of African history to be infused in the curriculums in universities and community structures. And he asks, do you have any proposal on how we can shape the impending reintroduction of history into the school curriculum? So I think these questions can be answered by both panelists. Thank you.
Okay. May I start?
Yes, you can start.
All right. Okay, I'm still digesting the questions myself, you know, because the questions themselves are very, very, very convoluted themselves, you know, that the questions themselves may even require a seminar. So as it relates to the question that is asked by our sister Unosizwe, and it's something we grappled with even in the run-up to this discussion. And I think one of the things we must understand is, if we accept that as an African people, right, we are essentially a dominated people. At whichever level we want to look at it, we're a dominated people. And if our basic aspiration is to be a free, independent, or a sovereign people, then we must also understand that nobody will give us our freedom, liberation, or sovereignty. We would have to go and get it. We would have to work for it. And because nobody will give it to us, it also suggests that those who keep us in captivity will offer resistance. And that resistance may include that they would be prepared to go into battle with us, which battle may mean those who keep us in captivity may be prepared, right, to take the lives of those Africans who want to extricate us from our condition. The question then arises is, if we are serious, you know, about attaining independence, you know, what sacrifices are we prepared to make? You know, so we can't, in my view, discount or dismiss the possibility of losing our lives when we want freedom. But at the same time, you see, any freedom struggle must also include the possibility of you defending your own life, right, by having to eliminate the lives of those who want to eliminate you, if you get the point that I'm making. So all I'm saying is that beyond this discussion, the reality of African liberation is a matter of life and death. And it's something that we must not want to ice cream coat or to romanticize. It is a matter of life and death. And this is why we have Patrice Lumumba today. This is why we have Dedan Kimati today. This is why we have Samora Machel. This is why we have Bantu Biko. This is why we have Mangaliso Sobukwe. This is why we have in South Africa people like Mgcineni Noki, you know, who understood the point that I am making, that freedom is not going to be given to you. You will have to take it, right? So it is no different for us today in our generation. The fundamentals remain the same. The cost of freedom, like Malcolm X has said, the cost of freedom is death, you know, and it depends whose death. Okay, I don't want to go to the other question. I want to hear if my sister wants to also attempt that question, and then I can go to the second question.
So that question is about history, being incorporated into our curriculum. Well, I think, I mean, quite literally, the whole movement of Fees Must Fall was exactly about that, right? Ensuring that our curriculum actually does take into account the histories of Black people. But also the argument, other arguments or other debates that are happening is, what is that history that we are actually incorporating into our curriculum? Knowing and understanding that obviously a lot of our histories is actually written by white people. And much of it is a distorted history, right? And so I think for me, the conversation needs to be elevated to when do we begin to actually rewrite our own histories, and then incorporating those histories into our curriculums. Because I think there's a lot of distortions that are happening in terms of what we understand as our own history within the realm and perhaps within the knowledge that is accessible, so to speak, particularly to those schools and universities right now as we speak. And we know that a lot of, there aren't as many historians that are Black and African and are interested in writing on African histories. And so I think my interest goes over and beyond just incorporating, the history into our curriculum, but also to say that when do we actually also begin to interrogate these histories that we have been fed throughout our lives and as we go through the schooling system, and how do we rewrite that again and actually rewrite it in the way that speaks to us as a people that have been dispossessed and truthfully from our own lived experiences. And so the whole project of decolonization and wanting to decolonize the curriculum really speaks to that very notion of saying that we want to reimagine, or we want to see ourselves in the things that we in the things that we consume as knowledge. And so I think for me, one of the ways in which I would propose that history becomes a kind of reintroduced into the schooling system is in those ways.
Also, to make the point that, you see, the curriculum is a part of the entire education system, right? So the reason why the curriculum is anti-Black, is misogynistic, etc., is Eurocentric, is because the education system is anti-Black, misogynistic, etc. So we must make a decision. Do we want to dismantle the curriculum, or do we want to dismantle the education system? You see, because it's not just about reconfiguring the curriculum, right? An education system is an entire process of socialization of young people into existing values, beliefs, etc. It's not just about curriculum content or syllabi, right? It is about the structure and the construction of the entire being. Now, if we just focus on the curriculum, right, I am not sure we are going to make as much progress. And I also think we must also be, which is the point I made in my presentation, we must pay attention to our nomenclature, because nomenclature also defines our concept of reality. Is this really our education system? And our as African, is this really our curriculum? Because our education and our curriculum should be that which speaks to who we are. Right? So anything that does not speak to that which who we are in the manner that you have described, my sister, that relates to the reality of our being, we must not attach the label our to things that don't serve our basic aspirations at a conceptual level, at the level of nomenclature. So we don't have our education system as yet. We don't have our curriculum. And the discussion should be, how do we develop that? And I've shared 3 examples: the Institute of Africology, Ebukhosini, and Ikamak. Those are examples and models we can look at, because what those examples teach us is that we are not incapable of designing systems of knowledge. We perhaps just doubt ourselves because we continue to look at ourselves through the lens of our enslavers. Maybe that's the deeper discussion we should be having.
Well, thank you very much for those responses. And I like that. It's a question that needs to hang with us as we continue about how we view ourselves. What are we capable of? Because that theme keeps repeating itself in some of the commentary that I can see here, like one from Viom Papela, who's saying, this has been a discussion going on even this week, and the commentary is, there's a lot more that young people can do in their spaces because we are not limited. And so, as our speaker is saying, are we courageous enough? Do we get into those deep reflections of courage on how we can do this? I'm going then to the next question, and this has to do, this comes from Zizi Elimnyama, which is a question to Funzani. It says, very valuable inputs on repackaging African knowledge system. How could this be made practical in the modern sense, especially the valuable example of taking note of knowledge systems from our grandparents in the village? How can we integrate this into the mainstream? And I believe probably this is mainstream, starting with curricular education, because that has been one of the areas that you two have identified well. And I also believe mainstream, as Veli is asking, our everyday way of doing, our everyday way of seeing, how can those be incorporated? Yes, and that's one. And then the other one is a comment that this begins with language. I think Veli has already answered that. Nomenclature, this comes from Setu Nguna, which says we need to begin at the level of language. And lastly, both of you, I think, would like to address here, the idea of archives. It will be good, as Alan Zin is pointing out, it will be good for you, both of you, then to elaborate more on that. Brother Veli, you can start, and then Funzani will respond as well.
Okay.
All right. I agree with the point that is made by Usetu Nguna about, constructing orientations for innovation is language, so I fully agree with her and that observation, because in how we use language, right? Because language is what gives us access to everything, even access to the imagination and access to constructing and reconstructing the world. We use language primarily as that facility. So in how we understand, interpret, and use language, will determine the type of Africa, as you said in your opening remarks, whether we use language consciously to achieve certain outcomes and not just reduce it as a means of communication. So I fully agree with the point that she has made there. The issue also, as it relates to the approach to archives, this is quite critical because one of the things that European cognitive and epistemic violence attacks, right, and has attacked over time, is the memory of African people. Their capacity to imagine, but also their capacity to dig and benefit from their own memory, right? Because as things stand, we have been loaded with the memory of other people. So even when you have to think and you have to imagine and you have to go into your own memory bank, what you extract has very little to do with who you are, right? So, and this is why, if you look at, and I want us to be very brutally honest, what we regard as mainstream universities today, right, are part of the problem of anti-Black cognitive and epistemic violence. And it does not suggest that there are no Black people in our current universities who are not trying to do something different. But the current universities as institutions are part of the problem of coloniality, of epistemic violence, of cognitive violence, and we must acknowledge that, and many of us continue to legitimize and promote those spaces, right? And if you just look at it, shouldn't the thinking be that we must create alternative institutions where we should be taking our children to? One of the biggest tragedies about us as Africans is that, which is of course a function of racism, colonialism, etc., but it is something that we must confront. One of the biggest tragedies about us is that we are one of the few, if not the only race group, right, that outsources the responsibility to educate our own children to other people. And that is one of the, we can't rise, we can't resurrect as a race if we don't understand that, right? That you can't give your children to other people to shape their character, to shape their world. So I want us to think about building institutions where we won't feel that we have molested our children cognitively, you know, that we love them so much that we teach them who we are, and we don't outsource that responsibility to other people. Thank you.
Okay. I think just to add on what Afrika has just mentioned, for me, just to also respond to the question around how do we reconfigure these knowledge systems, and basically from our grandparents and in the villages, and how do we integrate them to the mainstream. I think for me, like, we should engage with the whole idea of power and how power actually works, right? Much of what's going on right now is because there is an overarching structure, right, that guides the ways in which we actually understand ourselves in the world as Africans, as Blacks. And so much of the knowledge that exists in spaces that are isolated is not taken seriously, particularly because of how power works. Because also power, what it does is that it also determines what we take in as validated knowledges. And so also how we engage with media and what we understand as priority is exactly determined by the powers that be. And what we know for sure is that African people at this point in time do not possess any kind of power to anything in their lives, right? Be it economically, be it knowledge-wise. And I think that's also the reason why I'm also drawn to this idea of epistemic violence and cognitive violence, because really and truly, that's where it actually lies. And so for us to actually be able to integrate our ways of being and our ways of knowledges, we actually need to engage with the powers that be, right? So it's not a thing that we can just do out of nowhere, but it's a thing that forces us to go all the way and actually say, what does this liberation actually look like in its entirety? And so it does not begin and end by, okay, we are just going to integrate our own knowledges into the system. We can do so, but that can be suppressed by the powers that be, because the narrative that we are currently consuming right now is not a narrative that holds the interest or that puts the interest of the African at the center. Absolutely. The narrative that exists right now is a narrative that actually isolates and dehumanizes the African. And so I think that what we then have to do is to actually acknowledge that first, and then move into the idea of how do we actually integrate these knowledges that we currently have or have been isolated historically into our own, and how do we actually organize those? How do we organize this chaos, right? The chaotic life of a Black, how do we organize it and actually put it together in a way that future generations can actually have access to that? And so I think that also speaks to the very idea of archiving, and the very idea of what I imagine as, joyful militancy, because I think for me, even the work of doing that is, a work of joyful militancy. By that I mean, as much as difficult and painful as it is to re-experience and go back to history and want to relive those moments through archiving, through putting together this chaos, right? We must find a way in which we can be, we must find joy in that. It's painful, but the only way that can keep us going is actual joy. And it must be joyful to sit in that pain, because I think as Africa has said that, like, I don't think we're actually going to get this liberation unless we actually fight for it.
Absolutely.
And fighting means that we are actually going to lose people, and that is painful. So how do we actually reimagine or imagine what this joyful militancy looks like? We are being militant, but we are also joyful in that militancy. And so for me, I think everything combined becomes kind of a very important aspect in the direction that we want to take, as far as whether it be completely getting our liberation or integrating particular knowledges that have been isolated into us, into not necessarily the idea of integration. Also, like, I'm very iffy about it. I question even the very idea of integrating. But destroying and the idea of destruction for me is more of a thing that I would, move with. Destroying what we currently have and actually recreating altogether what this knowledge that we want the future generations, African or future generation, to actually consume. And so I think it's all intertwined, but at the peak of it, or at the height of it, sits the very notion of power, and how do we actually regain that power to ensure that our ideas and our interests are being put at the forefront.
Well, thank you. I think I'll just speak on some of the key points that you're advancing now. One of them being the issue of power. That's quite important. Power, and of course, our sister has just finished with on a point of a question. How do we do this? And of course, I think from what I can see, the questions that are following thereafter are all in many ways asking for more practical, concrete ways that this can happen, which you had pointed out. And then in relation then to those concrete ways, issues of power, there was a question that both of you did not respond to, and that was a question of how does this then turn in the mainstream? For instance, Sam Bainan there asks, undoubtedly African culture, history, and language and values are important in any development and governance framework. And now we're moving away from the space of conceptual thinking and theorizing to a very mainstream, everyday symbol of power that we see, and that is parliament. So democratic institutions as this, which are, charged with articulating and in many ways approximating what our needs are and our aspirations, using the facility of politics, which is quite powerful. And the question is, these institutions where power that can do a lot resides still reflect on neo-colonial and neoliberal processes and procedures. How do you then propose in this very powerful space of the mainstream, how do you propose a change to a more African-minded cognitive way of doing? And then beyond that, then there's another question. Is the role of African women, and of course I know at the university, this is a very big, there's a big movement already towards that end, but it will be good to also hear from both of you with regard to archiving the material for Black women, because Black women, as we know, have continued and still continue to be pushed. No matter how much effort they put, there's always the patriarchal system, the way it's organized itself, as both of you have pointed out, continues to push back. So I would like for you to respond to both of those. First, on the parliament and the power that is, and what cognitively can be done about those. And secondly, on the place of women and the kind of archive that can be put in place. Thank you.
Okay. All right. As it relates to the question, of how do we practically decolonize or reshape democratic public institutions such as parliament, for example, right? From a strict Afrocentric perspective, right? Parliament and its related institutions as constructed is anti-African. You see, they are anti-African from a strict Afrocentric perspective. They are anti-African. And this is why I made the point earlier that we must not delude ourselves into wanting institutions that were not designed for us to accommodate us. You see, so the parliament that is in Cape Town that we see has its genesis, right, in the imperialism of Cecil John Rhodes in the 19th century. That's where that parliament comes from. And if you look at the colonial violence that Cecil John Rhodes authored on us, that colonial violence and that parliament was designed to achieve exactly that objective. You know, I'll just give you two examples. I know we like to start with the 1913 Land Act, you know, as one of the principal pieces of legislation. But before that, that very parliament in around 1894 passed an act which is called the Glen Grey Act. Now, the Glen Grey Act is the act that set the basis for much of the pieces of legislation that facilitated the dispossession of land in Africa, in part of the South continent, but mainly in South Africa, you know. So, but what is my point? My point is we must understand the genesis of that parliament and what it serves to do. And if we understand its genesis, we won't be surprised that even the people who sound radical or who purport to be radical, when they end up in that parliament, right, they become toothless, you know, because that institution was not designed with Africans in mind or was not designed for Africans, like many other institutions, you know. So I continually get the subtext in our discourse that we seem to be, even though we don't say so, but it seems at the base of our minds, we continue to want to fight for accommodation, you see, in institutions, as if being in parliament, right, is something prestigious or it's going to do anything for us. It's not going to do absolutely nothing for us. You know, if we imagine freedom and liberation properly, being in parliament or having the majority of Black people or the majority of Black women in parliament is not going to result in the type of Africa we want or the type of existence we want. We need to deepen our imagination, right? And deepening our imagination for me would mean we must think differently. And thinking differently must mean that we must look away from institutions like parliament and build different political institutions of authentic African power that are going to advance our interests. Because parliament, not just in South Africa, but throughout Africa, has done absolutely nothing but entrench our captivity as a people. And we must understand where parliament comes from as part of the European cognitive axis, you know. That is my bite on that. Secondly, the issue of the archiving of the experiences of African women is absolutely important, you know, and it is something that is close to my heart. I'll make an example. What we call, both in South Africa and in Africa, the liberation narrative, right? The liberation narrative continues to be androcentric, right? You would get the impression that in our fight against colonial invasion, African women were not there. You know, not just in the 20th century, but if you go back 400 years and even 1,000 years, you know, so part of archiving would mean we would have to bring the stories of African warrior queens like Umkabai, African warrior queens like Mantatisi, right? And even in the contemporary terms, we must talk about African women, right? African women liberation fighters like Umama Nomvo Boy, you know, Umama Nomvo Boy, who was a trained, you know, cadre of the Azanian People's Liberation Army, you know, but in her own country, she is not known, you know, she is not known. a woman like Mama Dulcie September, right, who was assassinated in 1988. So when we even talk in South Africa about the so-called liberation narrative, you know, the stories of Black women are absent. And if they are there, they are footnotes. So just from that perspective, you know, for me, when you talk about archiving those stories, because a lot of the work that we do in Mutapa seeks to excavate and exhume the stories of African women from now and even African women in antiquity. So I think it is absolutely crucial. But you have amongst us here today an African sage, a warrior queen, a cognitive warrior in the form of Umama Unokuzola Mdende, Umadlamini. You know, students at your university should go and spend as much time with this warrior queen called Umadlamini. And they will get to understand the importance of the question that is being asked about archiving, because she is a mobile archive of the experiences, the struggles, and the creations of African women. Right there on your campus, you have her. Kamako.
Yeah. That is okay. Okay, so I think, I mean, yeah, no, that was beautiful also. I'm trying to gather my thoughts after all of it. But for me, I would say that, you know, neoliberalism and neo-colonialism or coloniality, as we may put it, part of the reason why we have these things that exist in our lives or in our countries that we don't understand as Africans is because we are apparently part of a global system, right? And so as part of the global system, many things, whether be in policies or in the existence of institutions, mimic those of the developed countries, right? And so the so-called developed countries, or the countries that actually do have power. And so I think one of the things that we find ourselves in as Africans and as Africa in its entirety is that we have a problem of being caught up in things that have nothing to do with us. Being caught up in or being forced into spaces that really do not necessarily speak to us. And so Africans become an afterthought in everything that is created in the world. So these things are introduced to us, and they are not by us, they are not for us. And then we try and interact with these things and try to try and integrate them into our lives, but they don't necessarily speak to us. And that's part of the reason why we have so much disconnection when it comes to fighting for our liberation and the actual lives that we are living, right? Because we find ourselves as part of this capitalistic global system that is prescriptive and has already prescribed the ways in which we should exist in the world. So things like parliament and neoliberalism are things that exist in a lot of our policies. So for me, I think it does go from the basis of industry to industry and how we actually want to conceptualize each and every sector of the life, be it law, economically, what does that look like? And so I don't think there's just this one way. Of course, we understand that at the end of it, we want socialism. But I think there are people that interrogate certain things that exist in particular spaces that can help us understand, for instance, a law system that is different, completely different from what we have currently. That can help us understand an economic system that is completely different from what we have currently, right? That can help us understand these institutions that exist. How do we eradicate them and formulate new systems that actually speak to us? So because we are victims of this whole so-called globalization, it's almost as if we don't, again, the question of power, we don't have power to determine our own futures to determine our own lives and what institutions do we want, if we even want those institutions in our country or in our continent. And so so the question of how do we, I just feel like it's very multifaceted. I don't think there's only just one way of just saying, okay, this is, because socialism is such it also needs to speak to other aspects of our lives, right? So for me, things like parliament don't necessarily, as Afrika has mentioned, don't serve our purpose. And if we were to interrogate the genesis of these very institutions and why they exist, we would find that they actually go against us. They don't put African people at the center of the existence of these very institutions. So I think when it comes to the question of how, I really like, I think it's we can go into each and every detail of how do we actually do that in very different ways. But of course, what we know for sure is that we want a socialist, state. And then when it comes to archiving of Black women's work, that is one of the most important things that I hope, as scholars and people who can think, people who are in different spaces should do. I think it's a very important aspect of collective memory. We all know that historically Black women, African women, have been excluded in very important decision-making tables. And right now, what Black women are doing is that they're literally taking the gun, so to speak, and they're literally taking the spear in their own hands to say, we cannot exist like this. And what interests me is that most of the work that has been done in terms of activism right now is really spearheaded by Black women. And that has been so historically, even though Black women have not necessarily been seen as the faces or have been right in the forefront. But I believe that Black women have held movements together, and Black women have spearheaded movements historically. And so that becomes part of the importance of archiving, because we don't know these things. There's only one side of the story that we know, and we are not necessarily exposed to other sides of the narrative. And so I think archiving is very important for remembering, for engaging, for how we actually want to interact with one another moving forward in the futures, and how we want to reimagine our futures. So yeah, I think that's my take on both the questions.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think together with what you've given, it would be good to also bring a bit of the discomfort that Brother Veli had already mentioned, because both of you spoke of one, courage as one of the main things in the face of a very big pushback. And then that is in many ways then, put in on the spot by a comment like the one that Simpiwe is asking here. The biggest challenges with regard to schooling, places of schoolings where we go. And ultimately, the thing that I pick up powerfully from the comment is the work itself. We should accept that it will be work that is done in snail pace for us, Africans and Blacks, to reach our destinations. What is your comment on that with regard to that snail pace that Simpiwe is seeing, finding ourselves in a tight bind? I mean, the description that our sister has given us, the multifaceted aspects that come to this. Sometimes we don't have immediate answers now, although we do know where we want to go. And we find ourselves in a very difficult position after many years of, struggle and an oppression that doesn't go away. What is both your comment on this, commentary that it almost looks like it's a work that will call for us to accept that it will be snail pace. It might not come as soon enough, even though we want to be bold and we want to be courageous and honest in our reflection. What are your views on that?
Do I go? Should I? Okay.
Yes, you can go. Well, it seems like our sister is experiencing some difficulties. I think, my brother, you can just go on while she comes back and she'll pick up.
All right. So, okay, she's back. You can go, my sister, if you're back.
Oh, yeah, your system froze a bit. You can unmute. Yes, there we go.
Okay, am I fine? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to say that as an activist, one of the key things that I'm learning is that it's important that we organize ourselves. I don't think there is any more powerful response other than organizing. For me, has been very important in terms of making sure that, you know, we move things in the ways in which we want to move them. It's very difficult to obviously organize at this point, given how neoliberalism has kind of made us comfortable in these discomforts, right? So it's very difficult to kind of not influence, but how do I put it? But have those conversations with people, with our people, to say, okay, we have not necessarily, we have not got to a point where we actually want to get to, which is the ultimate liberation, right? Neoliberalism and the ways in which it has positioned us in a way that says we have the basics, we are fine, we can survive, we can move around, we have liberties and freedoms that we never actually did, but now we are having those things. And so the kind of system or the state that we currently exist in pacifies African people. It makes us believe that we have freedom, but we don't actually have freedom. But I believe that one of the ways to move is to actually organize and to have clear-cut political or an ideology that informs that organizing, all right? Because a lot of time when we organize and we don't necessarily have an ideology that informs that organizing, we end up being all over the place and not necessarily seeing what we need to do and not seeing the bigger picture. And so I think what becomes important is conscientization, the understanding that we are not where we want to be at, organizing ourselves, making sure that as we organize, we actually are a critical mass. And I think putting Usankara that, you know, you cannot, the mass has to be critical. We can't organize without the conscientization and having a clear-cut ideology that informs that organizing. And so I think for me, perhaps that's one of the things that I could suggest as a solution right now, to say organizing ourselves in spaces that we exist in is important, and not being a unit is the very thing that actually makes even the pace of where we are going to be slower.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, brother.
Okay. Thanks, Mwalimu. For me, I grapple with this question. I've been grappling with it for over 20 years. As somebody who continues to live in the Black activist world, you know, questions about what is possible and what is not possible. So I also understand that question in the broader context, right, of the project of whiteness that has told us for over 400 years that we are inferior, that we are insufficient, that we are deficient, that we are incapable, right? So I also understand why it is sometimes we question ourselves, you know, in all spheres of human endeavor. I also understand where that comes from, you know, historically. So, and this is why I'm one of those who's very patient with us when we ask those questions, you know. So that is the first thing. The second thing is, it is absolutely important for us to attempt to understand the depth of the problem we are facing, right? So that when we want to imagine the solution or the alternative, we have taken some time to dedicate meticulous study to what the problem is, right? So there should not be a haste to find solution or alternatives, right? When we have not satisfied ourselves that we have done a meticulous study of what the problem or the problems are, in their various manifestations. And I think we understand some things and we don't understand others. And that is okay. That is also the beauty of growing and evolving. It is okay. Because in any case, there is no such thing as a human being that knows everything. Such a human being doesn't exist. And so it's important for us as Africans to understand that it is not an absolute requirement of human existence to have ready-made answers for everything. It is not. Part of the beauty of being human is probing, is investigating, is discovering, is learning, is also understanding and appreciating the depth of your own ignorance. That's part of the beauty of being a human being. And we must allow ourselves to evolve in that beauty, right? So thirdly, it is also important to understand that there is no lack of historical precedent where we as Africans have not overcome the people who've enslaved us. Usisi spoke about Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was in his 30s. In less than 5 years of being head of state in Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara was able to effect change that many of the African leaders were not able to do in 30 to 40 years of being in power. It's one of the lessons that Thomas Sankara teaches us. And Thomas Sankara is not something from 1,000 years ago. Thomas Sankara is somebody from recent times, which is a practical example of that. Black child, it is possible for you to transform your circumstances and create the type of reality that you want to create. Lastly, one of the things that is critical for people to translate or transform their reality is their capacity to believe in themselves. You see, so believing in yourselves and having all the answers are two different things. But like one of our teachers, Marcus Garvey, teaches us, if you engage in any project and you have no belief in yourself, you are defeated even before you begin. So one of the points of departure for us as African people is to work on our self-esteem. Then half of our problems will be solved, in my view. Amako.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, those are very powerful words and insights from both of you. I mean, I believe it's clear for everyone here. And thank you so much. In fact, I will pick up from what you just said. There's no lack of historical precedence. I mean, Alan Zane is pointing us to the work that was done by Cape teachers in the 50s, and the book is there. I believe Conrad have that in their archive. And so I would welcome us to look at it. I'm just beginning to think that as we begin to wind down, I don't know if both of you have, 3 minutes of closing words and reflections for us from everything that you've said. We can start with our sister.
I think, my closing remarks would just be to say that I really do believe that there's a lot of work that we need to do, and that there are sacrifices that will have to go into that work. Whether or not we are ready, I think the young people of today are very much engaged in, in imagining their own futures. And them being engaged in imagining their own futures actually means that they are coming up with ways of taking the struggle further, because I don't believe that the struggle began and ended with us, or will begin and end with us, but that we are actually learning from those that came before us. And it's very important to actually do that. And I think part of what I was trying to even say earlier about gaining knowledges from, what I would call isolated places, from my grandmothers in rural areas, is quite important. And it's very important that we humble ourselves enough to actually allow ourselves to engage those who came before us and learn from them, because there's so much to learn, but I don't think we actually take time to read history and engage with it in a way that can inform where we want to move or how we want to move. And perhaps also that's one of the mistakes that we did even during the whole Fees Must Fall movement, that there was a sense of feeling like we wanted things to happen right now. And we wanted things to happen in our own ways without engaging with the historical facts of people that have been through worse than what perhaps we are going through. And so I think it's important that as we engage knowledges, we ensure that we humble ourselves enough to understand that there are people who have more knowledge than ourselves, who can guide us through the process of reimagining these futures. So I think for myself, that's where I would end. And just to say thank you to the organizers and yourself, a program director, for facilitating this program so brilliantly and engaging us so brilliantly. But from my side, that's where I would end.
All right, can I go? Okay, yeah. Thanks so much, Mwalimu. Let me start here, as they are called program directors, but facilitators do not often get the acknowledgement, that they deserve. My sister has started there. Your job is not necessarily an easy one, right? It's not an easy one, but I often play that role. So I want to start by commending you, in how you have made it easy for us to express ourselves in the manner that we have expressed ourselves. Had it not been for how you facilitated, I don't think we would have been able to express ourselves in this manner. You made us feel very much at home, and I dare say, you facilitated like a true African does, like a true African, because this was really a dialogue, right? Not a monologue of some sort. So, Tsamaku to you, Tsamaku to you. And I would just want to say to us that we are a great people, right? We are a great people. We are unparalleled in many respects. And we must just not forget to look deep down in ourselves so that we can understand the depth of our greatness. And once we have done that, all that lies in front of us will not intimidate us. For as long as we remember, we are a great people, an unparalleled people. We Africans are a great people, an unparalleled people. Tsamaku, please say it.
No, thank you so much to both of you, and I'm humbled by your compliments. I would say, as a Swahili speaker, because I'm a Swahili speaker, to begin with, it's my second language. Bestowing me the honor of Mwalimu, that's big. I think I can still hope to be Mwalimu, because there are bigger Walimus that I look up as our mama, Professor Mdende here. She's a Mwalimu in its true sense of the word, and I'm honored for her to be here. Alan Zinn is a Mwalimu in the true sense of the word, because he's walked there. And so as our thinker, Ifeanyi Menkiti, the late Professor Ifeanyi Menkiti would remind us, it's processual for you to eventually emerge as an African in personhood. And I appreciate that you gave me the term Walimu. Thank you so much for being with us. At this moment, I think I'll call Sonwabo to close for us on behalf of Conrad. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, colleagues. Really, I appreciated this opportunity. A highly informative, and sometimes one would gauge the level and the extent of engagement from how our audience responds and ask questions. So really it has been a very informative session, and I'd like to thank our partner. I have seen on the chat a plead from our sister there from Roads and Vets, Tandugazi, I think is Achebe. She's calling upon us, the two organizing centers, Kenred and the Center for Philosophy in Africa, to continue on this engagement. I think I am taking that home as a way of appreciating these kinds of platforms. So really, I take that for tonight. And also to our great speakers, as I've said initially, that these are the great minds, these are African warriors themselves. When someone asks, if do we have any of these living warriors in Africa, I did not look far. I looked at these people, the work that you do and the kinds of utterances you provide, because sometimes it's not easy. It's quite intimidating, especially in our epochs. People are afraid to speak their mind. So you are warriors in their own ways because you can stand up and speak the truth. So to Babu Sompisi Uveli Mbele and to Ufunzani Mthembu, thank you so much, colleagues. NgesiXhosa ke sithi sinothulela umnqwazi. And also to our organizing team as well from Kenred and from the center that is led by Dr. Sam. Thank you so much, guys, for your persistence in hosting these difficult dialogues. To everyone who have attended today, I always, remind about Nukuti, we are in a very tight economic, environment. So to stay on a webinar for 2 hours because we do not provide data for you, it's money that we have sacrificed for 2 hours to listen to what these great minds are about to deliver. So thanks to you people who are part of this conversation. And before we go, just to remind our colleagues that this was our first webinar in the week of Africa Week. And on Friday, we are closing off again our second webinar, which is going to be on the 28th of May, which is Friday, between 11 and 1 o'clock. So Abandu should look out. Those who are part of NNMU community, we will put this on our memo. We will again advertise on different social media platforms. We are hosting Mama Unapo Mashiane. I saw Unapo somewhere in the midst, and then she just disappeared again. And then Baba Uvuisilem Shudu as well will be part of that conversation. And then Usetu Nguna, I've acknowledged to say to at the beginning of this program, she will be facilitating that program between 11 and 1 o'clock. And the topic here called now, we are looking at Africa's stolen artifacts and the restoration of our heritage. So I am also looking forward to have you guys on Friday. Masichonje City, thank you so much to everyone who has been part of this. We are looking forward to have you in the future. Thank you so much, colleagues. And thanks to you, Dr. Sam. And if we can just see people's faces, those who don't mind showing their faces, all right. Thank you, Setu. Siabulela.
Yeah, and Comrade Zen.
Thank you, Sonwabo. Oh, we still in nine.
Comrade Zen. Usisetu.
Okay.
Usisetu.
Thank you, Alan.
Pleasure. Okay. Thanks, guys.